Folklore besteach a chuirdeach ag agrán bhar a data hand of Blúiríní Béaloidis an podcréile a tíocht tugah ó Crílór na Hartlanna and so the gnúsach for the Desaran, Cláisna Holscoile Blúiríní. You're very welcome along to episode 41 of Folklore Fragments, the podcast from the National Folklore Collection, with myself, Johnny Dillon, and my guest today, Máirtín. And today, I suppose you might be listening to this on Spotify, SoundCloud, etc., or watching it on the UCD YouTube. If you are watching this, it means it's been a success to film it. If you're only listening to it, it means it's been a disastrous failure, and we haven't worked out the video of it yet. But with me today is Máirtín, and we're going to talk about an amazing book that came out recently. It was late last year that
September
that the hard copy came out.
Yeah.
Irish Food History: A Companion. And just, I suppose, by way of a brief introduction about yourself for the benefit of our listeners, Máirtín is a senior lecturer in the School of Culinary Arts and Food Technology at Technological University of Dublin. He's the co-founder and chair of the biennial Dublin Gastronomy Symposium and a former trustee of the Oxford Symposium on Food and Cookery. He's a chair of the Masters in Gastronomy and Food Studies in TU Dublin, the first such programme in Ireland. He's co-editor with Eamon Maher of Tickling the Palate, Gastronomy in Irish Literature and Culture, and with Ronan Richmond Keneally on the food issue of the Canadian Journal of Irish Studies 2018. And in 2021, Máirtín guest edited a special issue of Folk Life and Irish Foodways. He's published widely in peer-reviewed journals, edited books, conference proceedings and encyclopedias, and is a regular contributor on food history, chefs and restaurants in the media. In 2018, he presented an 8-part television series for TG Car called Blasta, which was good crack. We did that together. Celebrating Ireland's food heritage, along with Michelle Scher and Dorothy Cashman. He's co-editor of the New European Journal of Food, Drink and Society. And I suppose the impetus for this episode is to discuss the book, this tome. It's a beautiful book, and some info, I suppose, on Irish Food History: A Companion, the awards and nominations. It's received the Unpost Book of the Year award.
Well, the food and drink book of the year. Yeah, it was nominated in 2 categories, and then it won the food and drink category award, which was fantastic. Yeah.
And you were saying you're on there. It's sold out, but it's in its second printing.
Yeah,
already.
It's gone to its second printing now, so it should be back in the shops hopefully by late February, early March.
But it's also open access. You can get it online, isn't that?
Yeah, that's the brilliant thing, because it was also part funded by EUT Plus Press, which is an open access part of the European platforms, the European Universities of Technology. So if anyone just Googles it and puts in Arrow or EUT Plus Press, they'll get free access to it, wherever you are in the world.
Yeah, I'll leave a link up to it. Yeah. And the sort of opening lines to the intro, I suppose, are a useful place to start for us. And so the food permeates every aspect of food permeates every aspect of life and society, from birth to death, from the newborn's first suckle to the food traditions associated with Irish wakes and funerals. Essential for survival, it has historically proven academically elusive, hidden in plain sight. Entangled with the domestic and the feminine, it was perhaps traditionally regarded too mundane and too quotidian for consideration. Yet consider what can be revealed by applying the food lens to something as fundamental as our sense of place, our basic grounding in townland and byway. So before, I suppose, starting with the book, I just wanted to get a sense of your own interest in food history, Máirtín, or what's led you to, we listened to the huge sort of contribution you've made to this field. So where did that come from in your own life, in your own background?
Well, I suppose it's the old Shanukal, what you call it, Brehon and Duchas, Three Hul and Chuitz, you know what I mean, or the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, or any of these sort of sayings, is that I grew up in a family. My father, my father's from Connemara, Liam Macadamara, and he started off as a primary teacher, journalist, university lecturer, then was big into folklore and collecting particularly songs. He always had a tape recorder and a bottle of whiskey in the back of the car, you know what I mean? Classic. And he'd be up around the Gaeltachts and whatever, and he'd meet someone, and he'd either go into the house with them, or he'd bring them into the car with him and start, and take a song from them or a story or whatever, etc., and then he got into writing books and biographies and stuff for people like Joseph O'Haney and Brendan O'Hare and the rest of it. But my mother then is from North Leitrim, Manor Hamilton, Cluny, Ruark, and again, a brilliant woman, who had she had two master's degrees and all that sort of stuff before. But then the story, she was involved in Forest Taluntis when that was beginning, and that was the whole idea about actually energising the countryside and energising agriculture and farmers in the countryside. But again, it was a job she had to give up when she got married, because it was pre the marriage ban, entry into the European Union and all that sort of stuff. But in some ways, we're very happy she did, because there were 6 of us, and she looked after us very well, and we got a solid education at home. Even though, in many ways, you say, "Was your homework done?" And you'd say, "Oh, it is. Show it to me." Or you'd ask her a question, and she wouldn't give you the answer. She'd tell you, "Now go over there now to that book and open it up and find it out for yourself," sort of thing, and this sort of thing. But anyway, all of these things, and the other great thing about my mother is that she's a fantastic cook. And so there was always great food in the house. Yeah. So you combine growing up like a family of six kids, eating really good food, having the interest in a wide, diverse. We had Connemara and we had the Irish language. Yeah. We had all of those traditions and the mythology and the stories and the songs. But we also had sort of history and maybe more. You could say maybe some more classical learning than from my mother's side, and even my mother was into classical music as well. So we had a right mix in the house, and throw into the mix then that at the age of 10 or 11, I actually started working in a local grocery store, one of the old style grocery stores. They used to go to the market and all the fresh fruit and vegetables there, and they used to sell fish on a Friday and cut their own rashers, and sell the fuel as well as flowers and all the rest of it. You know what I mean? But so that really got me into food as well, and looking at food in different ways and opening my eyes to different things and traditions. Like in summertime, I used to go into the markets with Frank Mulhall. Mulhall's was the name of the shop. It was on Newtown Park, across from where the Wishing Well is now, or what was the Lord's Tavern. It's now at Dunn Stores, But it's interesting, going in there early in the morning and seeing, the corporation market vibrant early in the morning. Yeah. There was these big mountains of men carrying 2 4-stone bags of potatoes on their shoulders, who I thought they were like, Hulk Hogan Giants, or something like that, you know what I mean? And all of that and then there was a fish market there and all of that. So it really got into food, and they were very progressive, because they actually started selling different types of food. Now, this is from 1980 onwards. So you're looking, they were selling things like spinach. Now, this sounds stupid now, but 40 years ago or 45 years ago, spinach wasn't sold everywhere. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. Things like spinach, they were selling nectarines, kumquats, asparagus. And then the key thing there is actually, and it feeds into actually the chapter I have in the book, because the key thing there is one of my roles as a young lad there was actually to be breaking down 4-stone bags of potatoes into 7-pound and 5-pound bags. And that was, a role, and that was fine. But it wasn't just potatoes, because there were so many varieties of potatoes. Yeah. You know what I mean? Because people would come to shop in their shop, and depending on the family, they would either be wanting Kerr Pinks or Records or Golden Wonders or Pentland Dells or whatever was in vogue, Lord Edwards, King, this sort of stuff. So suddenly you got a realization of... You got a great learning about life, working in a shop or working in a pub or working in anywhere like that. Anywhere you're working with what you say, the great unwashed public, Ursula Gaziesel, you know what I mean, of all shapes and sizes and levels, you learn an awful lot about life, because the world comes to you. Do you know what I mean? And you see how different people negotiate and what they're looking for, and how, it's really interesting. Class, race, well, not really race, I suppose, at that stage, but all of those sort of nuances were there. So that was a real education for me, and I suppose that threw me up then. So by the time I did my leaving cert, I had put sort of 2 choices down about what I wanted to do. The first choice would have been First Arts here in UCD. And then the other choice I'd put down to do professional cookery in Cahill Brewer Street. Yeah. What was a CERT program at the time. So that was even level 5 or something like that. It wasn't even a post-leaving cert program, because there was no equivalent course at the time, up until I think it was 1999, the first 3rd level program in culinary arts started, So that's really where, and I remember this choice was being offered. And in some ways, my father was a lecturer here in UCD in the Department of Irish at the time. And one of the benefits of being a lecturer at the time was that there was free fees for the children. right,
Yes,
of lecturers. And there were 6 of us, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And here comes the eldest son and suddenly snubbing his nose at a university education sort of thing to go and do a cert course, you know what I mean? So my father said, listen, he'd seen too many people who'd had this sort of chip on their shoulder about not going to college or whatever. He says, this has been offered to you. He says, why don't you try it out for a year? See what you like. He says, you'll see it for what it is, and at least you'll never be wondering maybe I should or whatever. So I did that. I came here for a year. I studied modern Irish economics and history, and I stayed long enough to get my J1 visa to head off to America then, and I went rambling after that for a few years in the educational life before finally going back to Cahill Brewer Street, and I think I was 21 when I finally went back and did the program there, the 2-year cert program there in Cahill Brewer Street. But it really wasn't Cahill. Like, the thing is, I did a lot of travelling, so I learned an awful lot about food around the world and the cultural side of food.
Yeah.
But it was probably when I got to Cahill Brewer Street, and there were some lecturers there, one fella particularly called Jim Bow, and we'd be making these traditional, really classical French dishes, but some of these dishes would have been invented, after Napoleon won some war or something like that. There was a dish called chicken Marengo, which was invented after the Battle of Marengo and Napoleon's victory. And Napoleon's chef had to sort of think creatively in the field. You know what I mean? To create this dish. So they were out in the forest or something like that. So they had a chicken. So when they had a chicken, they also had an egg, right? And then they had, I think, because it was in this sort of forest, there were sort of wild mushrooms and there was crayfish and stuff like that. So this dish of a chicken breast served, with crayfish, tomatoes, wild mushrooms, and then with fried egg on top. You know what I mean? And I just love that idea, the notion of how a dish gets invented and the link between history and food. And I suppose nearly that dish alone sparked that idea in me, and to start look deeper into all of these things. Like, there's a soup which is made out of yellow split peas, and it's called potage et sou. And what I only realised a while ago is that actually et sou, it comes from the Bible, because I can't remember the exact story, but it basically, one character in the Bible sells his brother for a pot of soup. You know what I mean? And I think it's a Sue is the name or whatever like that. You know what I mean? And all of this. So there's just, I love that fascination. I suppose I'd had the curiosity from growing up amongst a very curious family. Yeah. And then to add food into that, and then add history into that. Yeah. Suddenly, I was gone.
It's fascinating to hear the background, I suppose, in terms of even your work in that market, where you were describing, I suppose, the presence of what would be regarded as staples in the Irish diet alongside what were then newer foods being introduced, or newer sort of items. I just want to read, this is a short article which I love by Patricia Lysett, and it just gives, in which she examines these phases in Irish diet. She says, it's convenient for the purposes of this essay to divide the history of Irish diet into 3 broad phases. The first and longest one stretches from the earliest documentary references to food to the introduction of the potato at the end of the 16th century. So that covers sort of everything you've mentioned there and beyond. The second phase extends from the beginning of the 17th to the middle of the 19th century, roughly 250 years. It encompasses the introduction of the potato, its establishment as a staple food, and its sudden failure, which precipitated the Great Famine of 1845 to 1849. The third phase of roughly 130 years extends from the middle of the 19th century to the present time. Is it useful to think of Irish diet in terms of those phases, or, I mean, surely there are, you could break that down into many more phases, but
yeah, you can break it down to many more phases, but that's the 3 main phases. And that first phase to remember is, what were people eating before the potato? Yeah. And what they were eating is they were surviving basically on milk and dairy products and oats, right? They were the 2 main things. Now, naturally, they had meat, and naturally they had berries, and they had nuts, and they had fish, and all that sort of stuff. But what's interesting about it is, and actually, I'll just go back a second, because I think about, everyone talks about this idea about hunter-gatherers, as in these early people coming in being hunter-gatherers, but they were really fisher-gatherers, because there was nothing to hunt. There was no, after the Ice Age, there was no big animals to hunt. Right? And one of the other things that came out of that is the idea is that the country was covered in forests. And because there's no big animals within that forest, it means it's very hard to make your way through the forest. The forest is very dense because it's normally animals that make the paths
There weren't
through a
these
forest.
large plains that people
Exactly.
could sort of rove across, yeah.
And so people would have been the earliest people here would have been fisher gatherers, and then the Neolithic farmers would have come in, and the Neolithic farmers would have brought cattle with them and sheep with them and pigs with them and stuff like that. You know, they would have come by boat. And what Seamus Caulfield in his chapter shows is how quickly you can go from having just a small amount of animals. Within 50 years, you can have huge herds. Do you know what I mean? It's quite convincing and really interesting. But our love affair with the cow is evidence all around us in something as simple as the Irish language word for road.
Yes, it's amazing.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like the Irish language word for road is boher,
Yeah.
which basically means sort of cowway. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And a boher had to be big enough for two cows to be able to pass each other or a cow to turn around. Otherwise, it would be a cuss-on, which is like a footpath sort of thing, you know what I mean? Or some other name, you know?
Yeah.
And something as simple as a boy and a girl, right? So, buachel, Colleen, right? They're the Irish for boy and girl. And a buachel basically means a cowboy or a cow herder. So, bua being from cow and then chuil being a herder. And then that chuil with the oif at the N afterwards become Colleen. So Colleen is actually a little herder. So all our Irish boys are cowboys and all our Irish girls are little herders. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So the most basic thing of all is just down to that.
Yeah. And
we survived mostly because the idea was that the cow was amazing because it produced milk. And we were the highest, up until a long time, we were the most... the highest consumers of milk in the world, and dairy products and all that, butter, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
But all the reports show that the Irish loved milk sourest and ate it in 20 different ways, you know, from the thinnest milk, you know what I mean, like as a nearly whey water, all the way up to thick, hard cheese like called tonnach, which was actually used. Queen Maeve was actually killed by a lump of this hard cheese that was flung at her, you know, in a sling, you know. So we would have been eating, you know, the dairy was perfect. The cream, the buttermilk, the curds, the various type of cheeses and all that sort of stuff, and all of them fermented.
Yeah.
So which mean they would last.
Yeah.
Do you know? And then with that, oat cakes, porridges, gruels, etc. And naturally meat as well, but they said that they wouldn't kill the cow only that it would be old and give no more milk. But naturally, only 50% of calves are going to be given milk, which means that some of the cows would have been kept for beef, and there must have been a large amount of veal, in that you must have culled a lot of those animals and used them if they weren't the male calves as such. You know what I mean? If there wasn't...
I just want to read something to what you said there, and it's amazing. This is a sort of a quote, it just goes exactly to what you were saying about milk and bon vig, as they were called, the kind of white meats, so-called.
White meats, yeah.
Referring to sort of dairy, which is really, to my mind, the Irish staple, the longest one ways. It says, these people were no mere drinkers of just fresh milk, straight from the cows, it were. They used it for various preparations, ranging from simple curds to cheese, collectively known as bon vig, literally white foods, but anglicised white meats. References are found to the place of white meats in the diet of the people from the early times until well into the 18th century. The traveller in Ireland in the 17th century comments, they feed upon white meats, and another says, they are the greatest lovers of milk I ever saw, which they eat and drink in about 20 different ways and love it best when sourest, which is fascinating because that as a tradition seems to have dropped out of our...
But actually, if you analyse that in any way, it makes total sense.
As a preservative measure.
Number one, a preservative measure. And number two, this is about lactose intolerant. Because when you actually ferment your milk, you actually change the lactose content of it. So there'd be very little, like in cheeses and a lot of these things, be very little lactose in those. Do you know what I mean? So the idea is that, and we're one of the earliest to actually develop a sort of this idea, a tolerance for lactose.
Is there a gene that people have for milk or something like that?
Yeah, indeed. But that would have happened gradually. But all of this is what I call sort of inherited wisdom. Do you know what I mean? That it's like the habit of hands. It's that ways that our ancestors have been doing things for millennia, and have learned from each other without necessarily maybe critically analysing why are they doing it, but there's a logic to it.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
An absolute inherited wisdom and logic to it. And that's one of the other things that I think is really interesting, because I remember in the chapter here about, I have a chapter there about, I think, 72 words for potatoes, but it's really, the argument is about using Irish language sources amongst food history.
Yeah.
But it was, there was an argument made there that the Irish government brought out a report all about sustainability and the environment and how they were going to save the environment. And in that thick report, there was not one mention of the Irish language, this language that has been spoken here for over 3,000 years. And it's within the Irish language that all the wisdom, like places like just place names, like think about the word Corky. Corky means the marshy wet place. What happens every time there's a high tide or whatever, or bad rain? Floods. Cork floods. Do you know what I mean? Anyone who built a town in Cork, if you only listen to the names, says, no, this is not the place to be building it. Do you know what I mean? Things like that. Do you know what I mean? There's so much inherited wisdom. Even I was listening, I think it was on the Tommy Tiernan show the other day, there was a thing like Nuravine, this is to do with Inishmaan, Nuravine's na paus there on Loch, being on Ballach leis a Gloch, you know. So like when the flowers are on the lake, the Ballach, which is the Ballan Ras, which is a fish that has been, actually this go back to the archaeologists, probably one of the oldest fishes that our ancestors have been eating is this rockfish called the Ballach, you know, Eragloch, you know, just at the rocks. You know, they're very particular, they stay in the same place, you know, all this sort of stuff. So all of this wisdom is there, but just to tap into it, and the Irish language is the key.
And in terms, that was one of the things that sort of startled me, that I wouldn't have really assumed to have such a central, again, it's like hidden in plain sight is the thing with a lot of this. And I wonder, would you be able to sort of explain about that to us in greater detail? You referenced it, it's a really good point, and it's made in the book really well, about these histories of a sort of a culinary tradition in Ireland that made no reference to the Irish language, essentially. But in the Irish language is contained a huge amount of information, local descriptions that refer, like you mentioned about Kirkig. I remember Eddie Lenihan on a documentary years ago talking about the same thing, about a series of a load of houses that were developed and built in Galway in a place called Bunnahowen, which was a floodplain, and they all flooded. But that the information is just there staring you in the face if you care to kind of engage with it, essentially. But what sort of references to, say, agricultural practices? Obviously there's a centrality of cattle and dairy and corn and so on. Do we see lots of food place names in the Irish language in particular, or what is there hiding in plain sight in front of us?
Oh, as I say, with like the place names, I spent it's a good few many years ago. I spent probably around 3 months on loganham.ie up till 3 a.m. Like it was my thing for a while. Like, you know, going crazy, just trying to milk all of the Irish place names I could find. But like, there's so many of them, from something as simple as sort of, you know, honey, you know, as in Cluin Mala, you know, the meadow of the honey, or even somewhere like Mellifont, like Mellifont Abbey, you know, that's basically means a fountain of honey, you know, Scards on Mala, you know, down to something as, you know, things like wild garlic, Crav, you know, there's Cluin the Grav, you know, Clonny Crav, and, you know, all sorts of things like Leaunacht, for example. Like this is, you're talking there about the 20 types of milk, you know what I mean? There's, like Leaunacht is new milk, right? And then there's the noose, and there's Moihel. So these are the B-strings, the colostrum of a cow, you know what I mean? That very first milk, you know what I mean? That's nearly yellowy, nearly custard-like. Do you know what I mean? So we have, you know, we have place names named after Leaunacht, after Noose, after Moihel, after Blách, you know, after all of these different versions of cheese, do you know what I mean? And milk and curds and all that sort of stuff. And that's just milk alone, but also getting down into the, you know, things like grouse and, you know, the hares, like Russaville, for example, is like the headland of the hare, you know what I mean? Down in Connemara, you know, Cantork is the headland of the pig, you know, Russmuck, and, you know, actually, the interesting one that they talk about, sort of soft places or whatever, like Corky, that the longest place name in Ireland is down in Connemara, and it's called Muikinach Idzerha, so which basically means the pig marsh between two seas. You know what I mean? So literally, it's all there. You know what I mean? It's all there. You know. There's
a few of them I have here from your article who references sort of food stuffs, and then has what is the item that's named. So cows, bulls, calves, sheep, goats, kids, pigs, boars, poultry, hens, grouse, furred game, fish, oats, and so on. And then you have an amazing list of these place names in Irish: Clúntarf, Drimmonley, Alnamo, so Clontarf, Drumley, Anamo, Glán the Valley of the Sheep, Glenageary, Ballindingour, Ballyvannon, Béaloidis na Muiche, Ceann Turk, Lug na Gulach, the Carca, so literally like the hens. So there's a huge list of
There's a place down in Limerick called Ula.
Really?
Yeah, it's just called Ula. Yeah. And then of course you have, you know, you've got Owlert, you know what I mean, which is an orchard. Do you know what I mean? And you know, and all of these different places, and you'll find them all over the place. It's fascinating. Yeah.
There's a huge amount, I suppose, of I think the thing that comes to mind to me in terms of this topic of the study of food history is just this sense of it being hidden in plain sight, that it's almost hard to step back to view it for what it is, because we're so close to it, or it's so deeply embedded in the culture that it's hard to sometimes step back to be able to see it. But there are those who have said, and you reference it again, you refer to it as sort of pernicious fallacy, essentially, that Ireland doesn't have a rich food tradition, or that it doesn't have a culinary tradition. And I wonder, where does that come from? Is there an element of sort of shame in our traditional foods, or sort of snobbishness in terms of what Irish cuisine or our food tradition is or isn't, or what qualifies it, or what have you noticed in that regard?
Well, I think a lot of it comes from basically post-colonial shame. You know what I mean? You come, any, you know, post-colonial people normally have moved away from what was traditional and look for the modern, and they look out. You know, sure, you have this in poetry, you know, looking east for a sign, you know what I mean, or with this sort of stuff. Do you know what I mean? It's but actually, when you know your history, when you know your past, when you know your folklore, when you know your language and your literature and your songs, and you know what to say, the history is written by the winners and songs are written by the losers, sort of thing. Do you know what I mean? The losers write the songs, but there's like songs is another thing that fascinates me, you know, and the idea about the amount of food. And like there's, for example, like Róisín Dubh, you know, like Róisín Dubh was written by a Franciscan about a nun in, I think, around the 1650s or something like that, you know what I mean? And one of the lines in it, agus doling fian Spáineach le mar Róisín Dubh, like I would drink Spanish wine with my Róisín Dubh. Do you know what I mean? And so there's so much in all of these sort of songs that sort of tell a counterintuitive story. There's people there not thinking that, number one, that that a Franciscan is going to be in love with a nun and that he's going to be drinking Spanish wine with her, you know, in the middle of the 17th century up in Donegal. You know what I mean? And we won't get into other parts that are revelatory about that song. You know what I mean? That might be past the family viewing and all that sort of stuff. But you know, all of these things are fascinating. Do you know what I mean? And you know, things like More the War, you know, it, like, food was used as a term of endearment there, you know, is to a churach na fati móra dashke leke talichum, you know? Yeah. Like, you know, you're the one who would put the big potatoes beside the fireplace for me, you know what I mean? Or, was it ní le fuichan na le barni na all the scudan yarga avalis misha móra ach le brandy lords or hasana, you know what I mean? Like, it was not with fuichan, the what you call it, periwinkles, or barnach, which is the barnacles, are all the scudan yarga, like, you know, salted herring that I'll entice Marta, but with just strong brandy from England, you know what I mean? And then when you think about it, like, the brandy from England is coming, the brandy is coming from France, but it's coming via England, you know what I mean? And all that sort of stuff. And then, like, that sort of history as well as understanding how actually at certain stages that actually England were in control of parts of France and stuff like that. So all that strong red wine and Bordeaux wine tradition came through that, and brandy and all that. And then when there was big links between Ireland and that region then, because with the Paisley, you know, the penal laws, you know, an awful lot of Irish priests or young scholars would have been sent to Bordeaux and places like that to train, and then a lot of actually Catholic middle class would have been sent over there for education, and they got into trading, and hence, claret became the chosen wine of Georgian Ireland. Do you know what I mean? Like, on this link, we were known. Jonathan Swift called Ireland the kingdom that knew good wine. So it's not just today or yesterday that we started discovering the old Merlots and the rest of it. You know what I mean? That that's something that fascinates me. That actually wine in Ireland predates Christianity. So we were drinking wine here before Christianity. It didn't just come because of the Eucharist.
Yes,
it predates that.
Yeah,
you know
fascinating.
what I mean?
There's another fascinating element in terms of food, just as you mentioned that in the context of Christianity. Again, in the Irish language, the days of the week, referencing early Christian practices of fasting, Céilín to Céilín Wednesday, first fast, Deardín, day Idrahai, day between two fasts, Dahina, day of fasting.
Yeah.
Where you have this sort of, again, it's all around us. Again, but without reference to the Irish language, these things are sort of absent to us. We can't see them at all. The other thing that's fascinating as well is there's a sort of sense of, on the one hand, a very localized, in the context of folklore archives, I suppose, localized approaches to, or at least the study of local foods, or foods in kind of localized contexts or whatever, but also the strong international element. So there's a sort of a binding of these two, of major historical events and these very small, intimate sort of local expressions. But one thing I remember being shocked by studying here years ago was the butter market and how central that was. Again, it's going back to dairy as a central foodstuff in Irish history. But that out of Cork in particular, wasn't there an enormous international trade of butter going around the world?
Huge, yeah.
What was going on there in terms of...
Well, what happens is that, because you were mentioned earlier on about Patricia Lysett and the idea about these sort of, three stages. One of the big stages I see that happens, that changes, is because, well, effectively, as I said, we started off eating corn and milk and dairy in all its forms, with some meat and some fish and some berries and nuts and the rest of it, which was great. When the potato arrived, that combination of the potato plus milk was wow. Like, it was like the nearly the perfect nutritional, complete food. You had everything you needed in those sort of two things, with a few other bits and pieces, a little bit of protein, a few eggs, you know what I mean, a few bit of fish, etc., etc.
Done. Yeah.
Done. But what happened then is that with the plantations and with the commercialization of butter, is that suddenly the diet of the Irish poor got worse, because instead of eating this butter, they were now trading it, paying their rent with it. Okay, so the butter then becomes it becomes a cash crop as such. Do you know what I mean? It comes what they pay their rent with. So suddenly now they're making this butter. And what's phenomenon here as well, and I think this is really interesting, butter making and all that stuff to do with the dairy was always women's work.
Yeah.
And then suddenly it became monetized.
Yeah, Kevin Danaher talks about this.
Once it becomes monetized, then the men get involved.
Yeah.
Right? And then the men originally are really actually anxious and embarrassed to be engaging with what was deemed to be women's work.
Yeah.
So they start selling the butter at night time when no one would see them and stuff like this, you know what I mean? And this carries all the way through, and this is really interesting because so we're talking there about the mid 17th century, like it's really from 1650 onwards, like butter becomes an absolute, like firkins of butter. There's these butter roads being developed all the way around to make your way to Cork or to make your way to Waterford or to various places.
There's an amazing museum there.
Oh, there's a fantastic butter museum in Cork, and there was the big butter exchange there and all, and then all of that butter would have been graded. So they would have been testing it out, for quality and all that sort of stuff. And then at the end of the season, you would get paid. Then the money would come back to you. And not just that, but what's her name? Claudia Kinmouth has a wonderful chapter in here called Joined in Butter, which talks about that you'd get more money if you actually filled a full firkin as opposed to just sending a few pounds as such. Do you know what I mean? So that actually women who trusted each other and who trusted the cleanliness of each other's houses and that sort of stuff would come together. Not necessarily best friends in any way. If this was like commercially, with people who you respected, from cleanliness more so than friendship, and would actually join and mix their butters together, and then they'd use things like saffron, right, to actually get a uniform colour on the butter,
wow,
right, And this is something you don't think about. You don't think about saffron. You think about saffron and France and Italy and stuff like that with the risotto and all that sort of stuff. You don't necessarily think about it here. But where you have the crocus, you have the saffron, and there was saffron grown and all this sort of stuff. You have filling the butter, quality butter, getting better prices for it. And later on then, in the 1890s, when the co-ops come on, Isaac Butt and all of that with the co-ops, suddenly women start losing because things, the men are always dealing with the cattle and with the milk, but suddenly the co-ops start looking after the eggs, and the women used to always look after the eggs, and actually that was considered to be pin money, that was their own money. The men never even knew how much they were making until suddenly that started going into the co-ops. They lost that independence, and then the check was coming in once a month or whatever. Do you know what I mean? So it's fascinating.
It is. Kevin Danaher writes about that. He writes about the sort of impact of modernization or increased industrialization on traditional practices, not as a great equalizer that they might have been touted as. And he talks about exactly that. But I never knew it was so early in what you're describing there. But he talks about the presence of the creamery and how the money that the women made from eggs and milk in particular was just went back into the home, or like you said, it was their money.
Yeah.
And it was in their domain, basically. And then it was sort of, that was, like you said, that was removed from that as a process. So there's something strange in terms of like the impacts of increased industrialization or centralization of everything, even in terms of like field sizes or herd sizes or cooperative, or even as you're saying there, where the production of butter no longer becomes a foodstuff, but it becomes it's what you're going to pay your rent with. It reminded me of it. We have a tape from the Urban Folklore Project, Lyrics Murphy, in 1980, and he's talking about fishing for salmon in the Alexandra Basin in Dublin Bay there. But he could never afford to eat the salmon. I thought that was so crazy. He's catching these, but he'd never eat one. Because it's worth more to him when it's sold. But sometimes the seals would come and take a lump out of them. They'd never take a whole one. And if they had done that, then they'd eat that one. So I just thought it was a crazy, a sort of slightly convoluted or just a weird output of this situation, essentially. But yeah, it's fascinating in terms of, like, I'm thinking as well of all of the legends that arise in terms of butter stealing, and the idea of the woman who changes herself into a hare, and that's in Camden's Britannia even in 1610, 16, whenever that was first published. I want to play a piece of audio here about that on this idea of the butter, and it's a very, very, very common legend in Irish tradition, and the idea that a local woman in the area sort of transforms herself into a hare, trespasses on an individual's land, and steals the butter profit, by which then when you go and try to churn the butter and turn it into milk, no profit will come. So this is Leo Corduff recording from Michael Shanney in July 1964, and he's talking about stolen butter and the blacksmith.
And there was another story you told me about a man with a cow. Another story you told me about a man and the cow had stolen butter. I forget where it was though.
What was this?
Some other man, he didn't live in Shilcashin, but he lived in Drum, I think.
Yes.
And he had a cow like that.
Well, is this the blacksmith below on top of the corner?
Aye, that's it. Tell me.
Now I have it. There was a woman, she was Mrs. Flynn, who lived below at Graham in the next village, and she had 3 cows. They were wealthy, and if they were turning until doomsday, they would have any but froth. And she was telling old Pat Graham, what? I told him. They said, I don't know what I'll do. They said, I not a bit of butter. Well, says he, I'll soon get the one that brought her butter gone. He put a red iron in the fire and they reddened it. And he went round and he struck the anvil 3 times. And he said some prayer. What come out and her backside burning but his own way. And to be wrong. Now he says, well, he was going to kill her. get back the woman's butter. She had her butter when she went home, then she could turn away. It hid his own way, and he didn't know it. His own way to had it.
And he was a blacksmith.
It's fascinating to get the sense of the I suppose the continuity and change of the Irish diet. One of the I suppose the other common areas where we see this is another area that Kevin Danaher referred to as a sort of the panorama that most reveals the whole of Irish folk tradition is calendar custom, in terms of the calendar dates throughout the year that we observe certain feasts and so on that often have particular foods attached to them. Do they still have a significance in Irish tradition? How have they changed in terms of our approaches to calendar customs? Have they been diminished, or are they still strong, do you think?
I think they're still strong enough. Do you know what I mean? And it's interesting because I remember talking to Angela Burke about this, and she was sort of making the case that one of the reasons that we didn't have so many Irish cookbooks is that we didn't need them, because we all knew we actually followed, excuse me, the calendar year. And it was so ingrained in us from childhood and growing up that you didn't know, you didn't have to write it down. You knew that, okay, what happens at Christmas, what happens at Little Christmas, what happens on Imbolc, you know what I mean? What happens on, Candlemas or whatever, all the way through, and then coming into spring, the idea about eating nettles, how often, and that you would clear out your kidneys, and, all of these different traditions, and then the whole idea about fasting during Lent, and, the times, what you could do with the eggs at different times beforehand, and even, as I say, what you call it, Máirtín Hinidze, like Pancake Tuesday and all that sort of stuff. And so follow it all the way through to Easter, and all of the quarter days have their own food celebration and their own food associated with it. Do you know what I mean? And what's interesting in a lot of them is that a lot of them are tied into potatoes and milk, as in literally putting the butter, the milk and the potatoes together and making brúitín. Are making stampy, are making boxty, are making what you call it poundies, or Culcanan, or Culcanan is linked in with so many of these things, and so is boxty is linked in with a lot of them as well, because again, boxty is not something you do every day because there's a lot of work in it and that sort of stuff. Do you know what I mean? And the secret of boxty is actually having plenty of butter to go with it, because like boxty is so beautiful with butter, fresh butter melted into it. Jesus, gorgeous, And but down to even lunacy, the idea of the frohans and collecting the frohans and all that sort of stuff, and all of these it's about being in tune with the calendar year, being in tune with nature, and it gets back to all the pagan beliefs and understanding that if you giving votive gifts and looking after nature and all of that sort of stuff, and these liminal times, as you're saying there about the butter stealing, like that was really around May Day. So the two, of the quarter days, the two that were sort of liminal would have been May Day and Samhain. Do you know what I mean? So the other two would have been, like, when you think about Imbolc and Lunas are very celebratory, because Imbolc, we've got through winter. Do you know what I mean? Celebrating that we've made it this far. The days are getting longer. Do you know what I mean? There's hope. There's grass starting to grow. There's a future. And then the idea about Lunas is that actually the harvest is in. We've had the harvest. You know what I mean? So it's celebrating. Whereas the other two are very much sort of cagey, and you're sort of hoping like this at Beltane. You're looking out, and there's all those sort of pishogues and stuff like that. The stuff within the folklore about, as you said, putting out like on Bratfriedse and stuff like that. So when she's going by, or sorry, that's Lala Breeds, but you have a similar stuff happen later as well.
The May bush and so on outside the house.
The May bush. The idea about putting even a ribbon on a cow's tail and stuff like that. The eggs that were kept, that were coloured for Easter, like they could be used as a prophylactic either on the bush or else put under the Antarshach, like under the mat, or the front door. All of these sort of stuff, and then getting into other sort of prophylactics later on in not quarter days, but things of Martinmas, for example. The idea, the tradition then to actually kill an animal on Martinmas, was the 11th of November, and to spill a bit of that blood to bless the four corners of the house, the door, the buyer,
The occupants.
the occupants. Even there might have been a cross put in a kid's head of blood. You know what I mean? You know what I mean? It doesn't get much more pagan than that. You're going out to the Papua New Guinea, you wouldn't have to go too far. Do you know what I mean? But this is within living memory, and this is folk belief that is there for a reason. Do you know what I mean? And even something as simple as we walk into any house and we say Baile year and number. God bless the work. Or you meet anyone, you say, God bless the work. Now, that's linked into actually, anytime someone was actually using a churn and a stranger walked in, the first thing they had to do was say, God bless the work, for fear they'd be taken, the butter, as I say, the good out of the butter, and all of these things. So even how we say hello, like Zia Huitz.
Do you
know what I mean? Like we did. As you said about hidden in plain sight, the language we use, we don't even realise that we're actually blessing, there's a whole load of superstition tied in with our language. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. And, it's fascinating, yeah.
And they mirroring the calendar year in the context of human life, again, Patricia Lysett writes this fascinating chapter in here, article in this, talking about wakes and I suppose as a theme to consider, one of interest is the idea of both sort of feasting and famine, of the importance of hospitality in Irish tradition in the context of food and drink and tobacco and so on, and also then ideas around sort of absence and hardship. Obviously we can't get into the famine as such, but I wonder, is it worth touching on any those as a theme in Irish tradition? What sort of expressions do we have related to hospitality first, I suppose?
Well, I suppose what you need to remember is that it's in our DNA. There's something we take this for granted because we're Irish and we've grown up with it. But we're not comfortable. If someone comes into your house, you're not comfortable. You're like a hen on a hot griddle until you have a cup of tea or a cup of coffee or a beer or a whiskey or a glass of wine or whatever it is in their hand.
Yeah.
And normally a biscuit or a sandwich or something. Because once you've done that, you're going back thousands of years. You're back to the Brehon Laws. You've actually fed and you've watered your visitor. So then you can relax and you can say, as my father always used to say, is tushke tuch na scale. Do you know what I mean? Get the drink out first, and then the story will come. But you need to fulfill your obligation as a host.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? And that's so embedded. And geez, the worst thing you could do was be known as being mean. Yeah. Can you imagine going to someone's house and you'd be there for a while, and then you come back and says, did you have geez, never even offered me a cup of tea. Now, all they had to do was they didn't have to make a cup of tea, but at least offer you a bloody cup of tea. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
They didn't even offer me a drink of water. Would you believe that sort of thing? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But then you're talking about the wakes and funerals, because there's, and Patricia's Lysett has a great chapter there about, looking at Thomas McCrahan from the Blaskets and coming out and his recollection of going to a funeral on the mainland, and the idea. And what's really interesting there is that we're talking here around 100 years ago. So 100 years ago, shop bread, shop butter, shop jam, right? And shop beer and whiskey were important. Do you know what I mean? Like they had a kudos to it. Whereas nowadays, if you brought some homemade bread or homemade jam, if you brought homemade bread back then, they'd hop it off your head like there'd be an insult. Do you know what I mean? But it's interesting how these things change. Do you know what I mean? And the cycles, and that's what I love about history, is that history is a cycle, and you see the same thing sort of repeating itself nearly every 30 years, and it sort of oscillates from one thing to the other. Now, never quite comes back the same, but they sort of oscillate.
It's fascinating. I remember again Kevin Danaher writing about that, about the disappearance of traditional breads, because what was the superior bread was the inferior bread, which is the shop bread. And then these other. But now what I find is a fascinating and a bizarre sort of tendency, and I don't know what you think about it, is the tendency for what would have been regarded as sort of lowly peasant foods back in the day, seaweeds and things like this, as being regarded as being sort of, I don't know, is gentrified the right word, or thought of as a very special food, a sort of elite food that posh people buy.
Michelin star here if you have, they call it foraged.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
But we have pictures
and this idea, like the poor people in Ireland stopped eating that stuff because it associated it with poverty.
Yeah. So what's happening there? What's happening there, do you think?
Well, I suppose the other things are like, it's the same to do with sort of making your clothes. Like my wife Linda, her mother used to make her clothes for her, and she was brilliant making clothes. But my mother, or Linda, would have been embarrassed. I remember Linda hoping, the first time she got a pair, I think it was dingo jeans or something like that. She was so excited that a pair of actually shop jeans. Now the jeans her mother made for her were probably much better, much nicer, all that sort of stuff. But it's that idea. Do you know what I mean?
Coat of many colours.
My mother used to make buns for us, so we used, she always baking in the house. So I would go to school, primary school. I'd have my lunchbox. There would always be a bun in it. Now I'd no respect for these buns because I had them all the time. Whereas I wanted like a snack bar or a packet of crisps or something, that all the other guys in my class would be bartering because they wanted the buns. They'd no respect for what they had. You know what I mean? So it's fascinating. But let me tell you talk about modern day folklore and modern day life and how things. I was at a funeral yesterday, a friend of ours' mother, and they're Protestant. But afterwards we were invited in. But from the altar, the rector says, now I'd like to invite you all in for tea and coffee and for our famous Protestant tray bakes.
Oh, amazing!
Do you know what I mean? So there's your food reference. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And sure enough, they were good. They were good Protestant tray bakes. And
amazing.
I
want to play something here in the context of, we're talking about hospitality, but sort of the opposite, which is the hungry grass, the fair Gortach, which was a sort of, it was viewed as a sort of space in the earth, the natural landscape that you'd step on, and was sort of imbued with the supernatural power that you'd be stricken with hunger, unless you had a tiny piece of oatmeal or anything, or a sup of tea would resolve it. So we'll listen to this now. This is Leo Cordo from Michael J. Murphy collecting in April 1965 from a conversation with Patrick Carroll and Mick Cunningham.
Did you ever hear another name on a field like that? Do you know the Shara?
No, the hungry grass. The hungry grass. So that's what you're thinking of.
The Fargota.
The hungry grass. Yes.
Did you hear about the hungry grass?
Yes, I heard of the hungry grass. If you walked on top of the hungry grass, you get lost in the field. You took a weakness, and you didn't know where you were going. You didn't know where you were going from that on.
Well, that is really so.
Yes,
I will support that. I mean, I feel that I had some experience of that myself.
Do you know
in Seafin on one occasion, as far back as almost, it would be 20 to 25 years ago. This experience, and sudden leg weak, and for no cause or reason whatever, and you even a half a cup of tea would relieve or any piece of bread or anything. You're supposed to eat the first food you can lay hands on to relieve this leg weak. It's some unknown power comes over you, and you lose your sense of direction, even as well as with weakness.
Was there any story among the people as to what caused this hungry grass? Did you ever hear anything?
I didn't personally.
Where somebody died of hunger. That was the story that used to be told, that somebody had died of hunger.
So Ray Cashman has done fascinating research on this as a legend as well, which he attributes to a narrative that arises post-famine, in particular, links into other sort of conceptions around the natural landscape or the supernatural landscape. And one of the tendencies that you find in tradition is that this narrative is associated sometimes as well with where if we were to sit and have a meal but not spill even one crumb on the ground, that when we left, the fair Gortach would remain in that place. So again, it's like the reference you're making to meanness earlier on. But the idea of hospitality is so ingrained and it's so essential, I think, to so many aspects, again, of Irish life, identity, and sort of community, that it's hard to see. We take these things for granted in so many ways. I want to move to finish up, and it's been a fascinating listen to you in a conversation. We could go on, but I just wonder about today. What do you think of in terms of Irish food history? What future do you think the localized traditional sort of meals, like I'm thinking of, do you remember when we were in Kerry, it was the pie, the ling pie at Christmas,
at Christmas,
or drisheen, or coddle. Do those have a place, do you think, or will they disappear and die out? Or?
I think the thing is that any tradition that is strong will remain strong.
Yeah.
And that's, tradition doesn't die. And think about it. What are these pies? There's potatoes in them. Where did the potato come from? Peru.
Yeah,
do you know what I mean? What all of these things, like this is, I've a student finishing off a PhD about the history of whiskey, and starts off at Ishkabaha, and what was in the compounded things of Ishkabaha, but actually saffron, ginger, fenugreek, aniseed, you know, all of these things that we considered, you know, they don't grow here.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? So we've been bringing foods in, we've been bringing exotic foods in, and they've been part of our flavour profile for over 1,000 years.
Since your man had that fig or whatever.
Oh, yeah, since that fig, yeah, and long before it.
Yeah,
Do you know what I mean? Long before it. The one I love, and I mentioned it in this, is the fact that Clonny Man, you know, that bog body that was found in 2002.
Yeah.
Clonny Man, right? They analysed his nails, they analysed his stomach, they analysed his hair. They found this hair gel in Clonny Man's hair that was pine resin that came from either north of Spain or south of France, right? So basically what this is telling you is that 2,500 years ago, Irish aristocratic men were importing luxury hair grooming products from the south of France or northern Spain, right? So in the boats that they were bringing with that, there was also wine and figs and silk and all of these things, you know, spices.
Yeah.
And then those boats going out would have been taking with them, sheep, wool, would have been taking salmon, would have been taking beef, would have been taking butter, all of that. You know what I mean? We've always been a trading nation, and we're a maritime trading nation. A boat never goes empty. It comes in with one thing, and then it fills up with something else and goes off somewhere else. Do you know what I mean? So,
yeah, interconnected. It's continuity and change, as Patricia Lycett would say. Thanks a million, Savage. It's good to, I think we finished back at the start in prehistory. But thanks so much, Martין. Really appreciate your time and chatting to you. The book is Irish Food History, a Companion. It's about to be printed up again, but there's the open access version. So I'll leave a link in the description for this episode where people can either read it online or get a copy for themselves. And yeah, míle buchas a sucht, and Legend. Cheers.